An interesting weekend is upon us here in Tallahassee. It's your Nole Insiders game preview delivered by UPS. I'm Lane Hurt along with Tim Linnefelt. Tim, let's start with the most pressing news due to Hurricane Irma. A lot of changes in the schedule in Florida. UCF moved their game to Friday. Arkansas State and Miami canceled their game. And of course, our game against ULM has been moved to noon inside Doak Campbell Stadium. Obviously, thoughts and prayers with everyone who's being affected by Hurricane Irma right now. Definitely something different for the Noles. It's supposed to be a night game, now moved up to noon.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to have too big of an impact. It'd be one thing if that change was announced, had to be announced on Friday afternoon or something like that. But getting the news on a Wednesday morning like they did earlier this week, I think they'll be okay. And it's not like Florida State hasn't played noon games before. So you move up your preparation just a little bit, but in terms of practice and all that, I don't think it changes much. And I expect that the impact from this will be pretty minimal. It has a much bigger impact on fans and the community and everybody else trying to make their plans than it does on the players themselves.
The Seminoles obviously moving ahead off of a defeat against Alabama and losing their starting quarterback, DeAndre Francois, to a torn patellar tendon. He is out for the season. In steps true freshman James Blackman. Haven't had a true freshman start at quarterback since 1985, and Chip Ferguson. Certainly uncharted territories for Jimbo Fisher and the Noles.
Yeah, that part is going to be different. We were all pretty impressed by James Blackman during fall camp, thought he had a really nice future ahead of him. I didn't necessarily think that future would arrive in week 2 of the 2017 season, but here we are. I think it could be pretty exciting to watch. It's a little bit of the unknown. Very few people know much about James Blackman. You might have seen him at that open practice back in August after Media Day and Fan Day. But everything you've heard about him so far is that he's got a lot of promise. Has a really big arm. Talking to some of the more veteran players, Alec Everly, Auden Tate, they say that he has a presence about him in the huddle that causes guys to rally around him. And whenever I hear that about a freshman, certainly a true freshman, saying things and doing things to get older players to follow him, I think, well, that's pretty impressive, because that's not always easy to do for an 18-year-old kid who's only been here for a couple weeks, a couple months. So I know I'm curious to see how James Blackman performs. I have a sneaking suspicion he's going to do pretty well, actually, and it should be a fun and entertaining season. And anytime you have a freshman, there are all sorts of question marks and things that go along with it. But when you have somebody who is as apparently talented as James Blackman is, and who is apparently, as Jimbo Fisher said on Monday, as poised as James Blackman is, I think there's a lot to look forward to.
Blackman, of course, will make his first start against ULM. The Warhawks, their Louisiana Monroe, prefer to go by ULM. Last year they were 4-8 under new head coach Matt Viator. They run a 2-quarterback system right now. I don't know if it's by what they want to do or if they're trying to figure out who the guy is. They have Caleb Evans and Garrett Smith. They completed passes to 9 different receivers last week and they lost to Memphis. They run a 4-2-5 defense. And then they also had some special teams miscues last week. They gave up a couple of big kick returns. What are your thoughts on ULM?
Well, a couple things. One, that 4-2-5 defense that you mentioned ought to be familiar, I think, to most Florida State fans. Florida State likes to run that a lot with those 4 defensive linemen and then the extra nickel back in the secondary. Florida State does that a lot, so it should be pretty familiar. And then looking at ULM's game against Memphis last week, the thing that jumped out at me is you mentioned those special teams. Special teams, of course, a topic of discussion at Florida State this week. Jimbo Fisher vowed on Monday that reteach and redo some things on special teams and tighten up some of those details that weren't so sharp against Alabama. And when you look at ULM, they gave up 2 long kick returns against Memphis. One was a 99-yard touchdown, and the other was a 45-yard kickoff return. So maybe an opportunity for Florida State to get some things right, get a chance to break a few things in the kick return and start feeling better about that unit, because like Jimbo Fisher said, they want to get that right and get that better before they move into the ACC portion of the schedule, and maybe this is an opportunity to get on that road.
Our key matchup for the Seminoles and the Warhawks is going to be, of course, James Blackman, the true freshman quarterback, versus the Warhawk secondary. Obviously, a freshman quarterback in there making his first start. ULM's going to want to try to disguise some coverages, make things uncomfortable for him. And Florida State's going to want to get him off to a good start and use those wide receivers and put them in positions to succeed for Blackman.
You know who I think could play a key role in that is Ryan Izzo. You saw the routes he ran against Alabama. A lot of times it wasn't all that difficult. He would just sort of run in a straight line for 8 or 10 yards, turn around, and more often than not, he didn't have anybody around him. DeAndre Francois made the throw, and Izzo was able to cut upfield. I wonder if something like that could be in the cards again on Saturday. The cliche goes that young quarterbacks love to lean on their tight ends. Florida State has a good one. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Ryan Izzo got involved. The other thing to keep in mind, and Jimbo mentioned this on Monday, is ULM's defensive coordinator is actually pretty familiar with Jimbo Fisher. He was, I think, a graduate assistant 1 year and then the linebackers coach at LSU in the early 2000s when Jimbo Fisher was there. So some familiarity with those guys. Jimbo says he expects a lot of different fronts, a lot of blitz packages. He said they play a lot of bear and double eagle fronts, so could have a whole menagerie of defenses on Saturday. But just something to keep in mind, maybe a little bit of a chess match there. It's not like what Jimbo Fisher does is any great secret. I think he takes pride in sort of doing what he does and making you stop it. But a little bit of a history between him and some members of the ULM staff.
And something I want to, keep an eye on, it might not mean anything at all, but, Tamorian Terry had a great camp. He's a guy who worked with Blackman a lot in camp because they were in the same unit. See if he gets any run with the first team, possibly make Blackman even more comfortable. Yeah,
no, absolutely. I think that's maybe a good point, particularly later in the game if that opportunity arises. We mentioned James Blackman as one of the pleasant surprises of fall camp. Tamorian Terry, I think, was right there with him. You maybe saw Blackman a little bit more because he was a quarterback, but Tamorian Terry is a guy who I think we were all pretty impressed with over those first few weeks, and it'll be interesting to see him get out there and show what he can do.
There you have it, Seminole fans. It's the Noles and the Warhawks. That game has been moved to noon on Saturday, so make sure you get to Doak Campbell Stadium early for that one. Make sure later on today to check out Tim's First and 10 on Seminoles.com. Always a great primer for the Florida State Saturday games. And then, of course, we'll have your 3 keys to victory on Saturday morning as well. Noon, not 7 o'clock. Make sure you're out there to support your Noles. He's Tim. I'm Lane. Go Noles.